Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our February Stone Living Lab seminar. Um, Today, we are so excited to feature our speakers, Christian and Ford. They will be presenting about Boston Harbor Now's Waterfront Visitation and Equity Study, which is a landmark research effort combining 4 years of statewide mobility data, decades of community insight, and novel research methodology and advanced technologies to understand who Boston's waterfront serves and where gaps in access persist, bridging research and practice to move stakeholders from insight to action across climate resilience, access, and stewardship of Boston Harbor. Christian is the communications director at Boston Harbor Now, where he has led public messaging, outreach, and brand strategy for nearly 14 years, helping institutions and communities adopt new ways of thinking about public space, data, and equity. Ford is a research integration consultant at North Carolina State University in the Office of Information Technology. Previously, he worked as a data analysis specialist in the Brandeis University Library, where he connected with Boston Harbor Now as a data analysis consultant. I will hand it off to Christian and Ford, and thank you so much again for joining us.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Joe. I'm going to share my screen, just making sure that everyone can see it. Um, Thumbs up if you can see my slide. Fantastic. All right. First of all, hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. And I want to thank Joe, Alexis, and the Still Living Lab team for the invitation to be here and presenting at the seminar. I am, as Joe mentioned, Christian Merfeld. I'm with Boston Harbor Now. Boston Harbor Now is one of the lead partners of the Stone Living Lab with UMass Boston and nearly a dozen public and private agency partners as well. Specifically, I also served on the team that helped to launch the Stone Living Labs brand back in 2020. And for the last 4 years, I've been leading the Waterfront Visitation Equity Study, which I belovingly call WAVES. And this is my colleague on the study, Ford. Ford, you just want to quickly say hello?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Ford Fishman. I'm currently a research integration consultant at North Carolina State University, but when I was working on this project with Christian and with BHN, I was at Brandeis University as a data analysis specialist, and I'm really excited to talk through the work that we did for that project.
Appreciate it, Ford. Thank you. That project, more specifically, this project sits at the intersection of public space, data, and equity. And what we're hoping to share with you today is not just findings, but a methodology for responsibly using big data to answer policy relevant questions and to move them towards change. I'll frame the problem and the strategy, and then Ford will walk you through the project's research and analysis. At the end of the presentation, as you heard Alexis and Joe say, we will be saving some time for questions that you may have. So, the big question. There's been a question that has nagged Boston Harbor Now and our legacy organization for decades. It's a metric that was largely undefinable, at least not in a very clean and clear way. And many of you on the research and data side would probably be able to appreciate this. Trying to be able to quantify how many people use the Boston's waterfront. That was a metric on our organizational dashboard, like year-on-year growth of visitation and usage of the waterfront was something really hard to be able to sort of put our finger on in a sort of measurable way. What we know now from having done this study, and Ford will walk you through the technicalities of it, is that the Boston waterfront draw tens of millions of visitors each year. It supports recreation, it supports climate resilience, as you all on the Stone Living Lab will know very well as economic activity. And if you're a follower and lover of Olmsted, you also know that the waterfront, this public park space, open space, is also a supporter of civic life, a great democratic space for all of us to be able to benefit and share equally in. But the data and the lived experience show persistent underrepresentation of BIPOC people, specifically Black, Latino, and API residents here in the city of Boston and the region. So the real question became, if we, as a community, as a city, as a Commonwealth, are investing heavily in our public spaces, our public waterfront. Who is actually benefiting? Who is actually getting to utilize it, and how, and who isn't? Has be sort of evolved. The question that became evolved to Waves was created to move that conversation from assumptions to evidence, and then move it into informed action, as you'll hear me talk about. This study combined billions of anonymized mobility records, as you heard Joe say at the beginning, with first-party qualitative data from interviews. It incorporated cutting-edge geospatial data techniques, Ford will go into very specific detail on, and demographic data from the US and City of Boston census. The goal was never to just acquire data and documenting big data. It was designed as a layered evidence for insight, for impact, and for change. Through hours of direct interviews that we had, we recorded and analyzed the use and visitation across the public waterfront, as told by people who lived, worked, and spent time there. We were not only counting the visits and the visitors. We were asking what visitation patterns says about access and barriers and the gaps between the two. The deliverables of this project were designed to move beyond just a PDF or a printed report gathering dust on a shelf, which unfortunately many of us know too well is the result of some studies that get put out there. We had planned for a multi-format release. We, by Ford's insistence, had planned an open data, open source tool that is housed on GitHub, which we'll talk to you a little bit more about. We also planned for public-facing storytelling. And finally, in the fall of this year, we'll be convening a summit where we will be moving these insights, this data, into shared strategies to be able to address some of those equity gaps. Here's a brief overview of the project's timeline from 2022 to present day. The ideation, funding, and partnership and data acquisition to analysis and reporting is obviously covered in these 4 years. And then obviously just last winter, we released the final report for the project with this year focused on implementation of these findings, of these analyses. This year, Boston Harbor Now, our strategic plan has us reimagine how we are engaging with some of the underrepresented demographics and communities present in the study. And we're hoping to, and we've just launched an RFP to develop a strategic program plan to move the Waves data into implementation to reach those communities and hopefully begin to address some of those equity gaps and representation gaps that Waves is pointing to. In the fall, as I mentioned, we are partnering with CREW, the Coalition for Resilient and Inclusive Waterfront, and hosting a half-day summit where we will begin to create shared strategies, with stakeholders of the public waterfront to be able to address those issues in a much more scalable way beyond just this organization. What I'm hoping that you're hearing that is unique about this approach is that Waves was built differently and that than your typical research project. As you heard Joe talk about in my bio, am not a researcher. My colleague Ford is much more so that. I'm a communications professional. And this study was built from and through that lens. And the research design, I think in many ways reflect not only who and how I wanted the data to reach, but also the advocacy and sort of the momentum and impact that I was hoping these findings would also drive as well. So that's sort of a thing to sort of hold as I'm sort of I run you through some of these partners that are a part of the design. Identifying our subject matter experts, because again, I'm not a researcher, was the critical first step for this process. Working with Tectonic, starting at the top, in Verisets, those were our technology and our data partners. The second crucial step was identifying an academic advisor. This is Nishant Kishore, who happens to be a Harvard-trained epidemiologist, who up until 2024 worked at the CDC's advancing their global crisis initiatives all over the world. Uh, how I discovered Nishant was an interesting point. On my morning runs, I was listening to podcasts and trying to understand as much about mobility data and big data as possible. One of the podcasts that Nishant happened to be on was him arguing that mobility data could not be the only source of data that people use to analyze, movement patterns and so on and so forth. And as soon as I found out that he was actually relatively local, I said to myself, this is the person that I do not want to have this report go up against in the real world. I would want to have this person be on my side and have this research process be built from the start to speak to someone with this skepticism. The podcast was called Data Skeptic. So in many ways, many of these partners, rather from the subject matter experts to the academic, the advisors, and then to the project steering committee, are built around sort of the concept of who do I want on our side in terms of being able to sort of identify the data that we're looking at, and then also helping carry water for this research and data as the project and study is conducted. We worked with Mass Inc. As a sub-study for validation. This is a local polling firm that has done great work across the Commonwealth in terms of gathering data, whether it be through phone polling or through what they did with us, which was in-person surveying. And Ford will talk to that in a little bit more detail. But the 20 public agencies and nonprofit members helped us not only guide our approach to making sure that we were doing this ethically, we're doing it thoughtfully and comprehensively, but also help to shape the queries for the data. Just because data can tell many different types of stories, but we wanted to make sure that as we were building these queries for the big data, the folks within this committee were informing how and what type of answers we're looking for. And of course, for academic rigor, we brought on a third-party data analyst to help us with analysis and review, and that's where I'm going to turn it over to Ford.
All right. Thank you, Christian. Could you go to the next slide, please? Great. So thanks, Christian, for having that overview of the project as a whole. I'm going to now transition a bit to my role on the project, providing, like Christian said, the independent data analysis and trying to translate the data into something that is understandable to a non-technical audience. I think that's a big piece of this, is to making sure whatever is found is broadly understandable to as many people as we can reach with it. So I'm going to talk through my process providing that analysis today. I think a good place to start with that is just giving a high level overview of the data that we were working with. So Christian mentioned the term mobility data. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is now. So mobility data is essentially records from mobile phone pings. So that's sending information, typically via apps. So these records, they'll have associated latitude, longitude, and IDs for different devices, as well as timestamps. And these data, they get collected by various groups and companies that will distribute the data. And on the left, you can see some examples of this. These are spatial distributions of mobile phone ping data on the top. And on the bottom is a map of unique users to kind of show a slight difference there. This is out of a study from Japan that's in Nature. But we'll get into a little bit now of what our data looked like a little bit more. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as Christian mentioned, two important partners here were Veriset and Tectonic. So the data itself, I mentioned it has to be aggregated, and the group that did that for our data was Veriset. Veriset provides data as a service. And so they had this massive amount of data, this geospatial data. But with that, it's really important to be able to parse that down into manageable pieces, and that is what Tectonics did. So they hosted the data on a geospatial data analysis platform, and their team curated the data and provided some QA QC of it as well to make it the most useful for our for work in general and for our study. So some examples of what they did is that they linked devices to census block group information that was able to tie the device data to demographic information. They transform some of the ID information to get unique IDs per day to understand who's coming every day. And they also were able to transform the ping information into an estimate for total number of visits and visitors. And I'll get into a little bit of the technical definition of those two later. And so from our point of view, we were users on this Tectonics platform. We would log in and we would perform queries where you'd say like, I want information from this location at this time, and you would get returned to you some summary information about that query in the form of like a table or a plot. Next slide, please. So to give you a better picture of the study zone, here's a screenshot of that. So this is directly from the Tectonics platform itself. So this is the waterfront. We'll sometimes call it the broad waterfront. So if you may see me refer to it that way later on. Stretches from Salem to Hull, 170 square miles. And this area is covers places a half-mile radius from the water and includes coastal regions as well. So islands, which will become relevant later on as well. And the data also covered 4 years, so from 2019 through 2022. So a really interesting study period of before the advent of COVID-19 when it came, and then the following years after 2020. So a really interesting period to be looking at this sort of visitation information. So next slide, Christian. Yeah, so we further wanted to break this down into groups of parcels or polygons, groups of areas within the broader waterfront. So the first kind of study zone is just the broad waterfront in its entirety, which the information for was in the previous slide. But also we have three other areas that are subsets of the broad waterfront. So the Harbor Walk is a 43-mile walking space that's along the Boston coast. So that is a particular piece of this that we were interested in getting some information about, as well as a subset that included just waterfront parks. This included 28 parks that were on or near the Boston waterfront, and the Boston Harbor Islands, of which there are 34 in the data. And also interesting to get this sort of information about the islands. Next slide, Christian. So as Christian did mention, mobility data is great, but there are a lot of things that you need to be a little bit careful with regards, because it has some quirks. Now it's very powerful. You can get a lot of data, billions of records over long periods of time, capture information that you couldn't do through other methods. But it again has some quirks, and so our academic advisor, Dr. Nishant Kishore, had a couple papers in Nature, sorry, not in Nature, in various publications that were relevant to these sorts of issues of what you can run into when working with this data. So some of it is stuff like ping location can be a little bit unreliable. So the exact latitude and longitude it gives you can be off by certain degrees depending on some factors. You can also think about, not everyone is using their phone constantly as much as we might think that they are. And that the distribution of who is using their phone more is, not always entirely reflective of the whole population. People can get new devices. They might show up as a different person kind of in the data in that way. Um, People can also ask apps not to track them, and then they would not have show up in these data sets at all. So there's a lot of different caveats to the data. And one of the recommendations that Dr. Kishore had for us was, having a complementary data set collected by some more conventional means would be really important for understanding exactly what we're looking at with regards to this mobility data. Um, and understand a little bit better. So that is what we did. Next slide, Christian. Um, so BHN contracted Mass Inc. Polling Group to conduct a sub-study for validation. So Mass Inc. Polling Group has a lot of experience in the Boston area of surveying populations and getting information out about them. And so they were very great in this process. They did a deep dive on 5 different parks that are in the Boston waterfront area. These parks are Christopher Columbus Park, Castle Island, Martin's Park, Pierce Park, and Pope John Paul II Park. So these are part of the Veriset data as well, which is really ideal to get that comparative approach that we had that Dr. Kishore had recommended. And so in this study, it took place in August 2023. They got about 1,500 survey responses from park goers, as well as foot traffic counts for those 5 parks for that month as well. So, a very good data set for us to do this comparison. And next, I'm going to go into a couple of the results of that comparison so you can get a flavor for kind of how that looked. Next slide, Christian. Yeah, so this is a visualization showing a comparison of the Veriset data and the Mass Inc. data for the percentage of visitors belonging to different races. On the x-axis, you have various races. On the y-axis, you have the percentage belonging to that. The different bars represent those different parks, as well as a black bar that shows the total across all parks for that percentage as well. So the data sets that we had really align pretty strongly on race. You can see that in both data sets, white visitors make up the majority, ranging from 60 to 70%. And but there also are notable peaks of visitors of color at different parks that are consistent between the 2 data sets as well. So you can, if you look at the black visitors, you can see that there's a spike at Pope John Paul II Park for both of the data sets, as well as for Latino visitors. There's another spike for at Pierce Park. And so even though the spikes aren't exactly the same size, it's really encouraging that for the purpose of seeing that these data sets have some alignment, that there were, some spikes in common between the 2 of them. Next slide, Christian. But that's not to say that all of the data showed quite as strong of alignment. So here is a similar plot, but for education. The y-axis is the same, and the bars are themselves the same, but the x-axis is the highest level of education attained by the visitors. You can see a few things. I think one thing that is a little bit in common between the 2 data sets is that there's not some huge differences between and among parks for education, but some of the spikes that you see, for instance, in Mass Inc. and in the bachelor degrees, you're not seeing as much in the Veriset data. So there's a lot of reasons for this. You might also notice that some of the kind of the bins or the labels for these are not the same between the 2 data sets. So some of the disagreement may be, or lack of alignment may be due to that reason, as well as education is a self-reported metric. So there may be some inconsistencies for that reason as well. Um, this isn't to say that Veriset is going to be completely inaccurate talking about education. It's just that we don't see alignment as strongly here as we did for race. And so I'm going to focus later on talking a little bit more about some of the racial analysis that I did for that reason. All right, next slide, Christian. Yeah, so the comparative piece was sort of the first step of the project. The next and the biggest part of the project was a query analysis. So BHN provided 25 target queries for the Veriset data to try to understand and get at different questions that they were interested in. And so, what my job was as a data analysis specialist and a consultant for this project was to take those plain English queries and turn them into something more quantifiable. So, for instance, a query was who is coming to the waterfront. To kind of address this and answer this in some sort of quantifiable way, could rephrase this as summarize the demographic makeup of waterfront visitors, or that to address like a piece of this question. Another thing that I had to think about for these queries was, I can turn them into something that is quantifiable, but do the data actually have, the ability to answer these questions at all? So an example of one that we couldn't really address was how many parks do people visit outside of their neighborhood? For a variety of reasons, this just wasn't in the tectonics, summaries of the data that we had. We didn't have information about, how many times an individual device was found in various different locations. So that's an example of something that was unfortunately a very interesting question, but not within scope for the data that we had. Once I was able to, if the question was answerable, I could then extract data and wrangle to try to address the question. And then from there, my job was to interpret what I was seeing in the data and then summarize it for a non-technical audience to make it as understandable as possible. And we'll show you a little bit later that there's a link to the formal report that I wrote. That was a big piece of this project, was writing that out in a comprehensible way. And I'll now go into just an example of one of these queries, just to give you a taste of the process. So yeah, the query I'll be mainly focusing on is who is coming to the waterfront, the one that I mentioned earlier. So the first step is to go into the Tectonics platform and actually query the mobility data. So to kind of parse the data, first wanted to retrieve total visits and visitors. So I mentioned this kind of idea before. So just to be clear, visits are essentially, how many times an area or like a park was frequented, and visitors are, how many people are coming to an area. So if you think about it, like a visitor can visit a park multiple times. So it gives you different pieces of information about, how many people are coming versus how often people in general are coming. Not tied to, a specific person as much. So once I did that breakdown, I would separate the data into 4 different groups. Those 4 zones that we mentioned: the broad waterfront, harbor walk. You may again hear me call this the narrow harbor walk. Waterfront parks and the Boston Harbor Islands. Separate out this information into the 4 years, 2019 through 2022, and then filter the data on different demographic categories like race and education, among others as well. And then the actual analysis that I did was done in Python. I used that for data wrangling and visualization. I would do some sort of, for this query in particular, I would translate values from absolute counts to percent change, with using 2019 as sort of a baseline. And the reason to take this approach is mobility data is a little bit, you might find yourself making some more difficult conclusions if you're just relying on absolute counts. It's a little bit less reliable for that. But when you start comparing it to itself, that's when it becomes a lot more powerful. And so, given that 2019 is this year, before the pandemic, to have as a baseline, we found it to be a pretty useful approach to make everything kind of compare to that. All right, so let's get into some of what I found. So, just to orient you to this visualization, I started off with it being a little bit blank. So we have the four different zones on this figure, and the x-axis is the different study years, and the y-axis is percent change. So for each of these plots, the percent change from 2019 is going to be 0 because the data started at 2019. So you can go forward, Christian. So in blue, we have the percent change of the visits compared to 2019, and in red is the percent change of the visitors. So in the broad waterfront, so this is all of the information, you can see that there's a decrease for both of those metrics in 2020 and 2021, with somewhat of a rebound happening in 2022. So there's actually more visits occurring in the broad waterfront in 2022 than there were in 2019. Even though is a slight rebound in the number of visitors, this doesn't quite reach back to where the number was in 2019. Go to the next one, Christian. And this shows a somewhat similar pattern. You don't see quite as much of a gap between the visits and visitors, but you do see a decline for both of them in 2020 and again in 2020 and 2021. With a slight rebound with the number of visits, but still not reaching back to that 2019 baseline. But that's a little bit different if you look at the waterfront parks and the Boston Harbor Islands. So if you look at these, you can see that in 2020, there actually is an increase relative to 2019 in the number of visits and the number of visitors, which is really interesting. And that spike is very dramatic, especially in the Boston Harbor Islands. Now, after that, you can see that number tail off a bit and actually go down. But it's a really interesting kind of paradigm that we're seeing here. I will note that the Boston Harbor Islands, they do have a smaller sample size, so there's a little bit more instability there, just because there's not as many people coming and going. And if I have another sort of visualization, if you go to the next slide, to show this effect in another way. So as opposed to the percent change, here I'm showing a ratio or kind of a rate of visits per visitor. So this is essentially showing you how often, on average, a given visitor actually visited these areas. And so almost uniformly, you can actually see that there's an increase in the visits per visitor for each of the four sets of areas, which is really interesting. And it's Christian, I think it zoomed out of the presentation, but I can still keep talking about it while get that up to speed. So it's just really interesting to think about the fact that you see this sort of recovery and this increase in the number of uh, visits per visitor, even though you could see the total number of visitors was going down from year to year. So it's very,
Or just want to confirm that you can still see the slide.
yeah, it's just showing the more like uh, Google Slides view of it.
Okay,
But we can still see.
keep going.
All right. Yeah, we can go on to the next one then. Great. Oh, one back. Yeah, so bring back to the equity piece. We wanted to look at how visitations numbers were changing for people of color over this sample as well. And so on the y-axis for these plots, you can see the percent of total visits that are coming from non-white visitors. And again, there's a remarkably consistent pattern for these four groups of areas that this percentage increases from 2019 to 2020 and 2021. So the percentage of visits coming from non-white visitors for those years went up, um, with again another drop down in 2022. I will say that even though there was these spikes, the percentage from white visitors was still at least like 60% the entire time for all these areas as well. So there's still, equity at the waterfront, not like an entirely solved thing from this figure, but just a very interesting and consistent pattern that we saw. Next slide. So there were a variety of other queries that we went into. Uh, Given that there's some climate focus to some of what this group is interested in, I wanted to present one of the queries that was particularly climate relevant, sorry. And this was essentially asking, do days of extreme heat show more visitation in the Narrow Harbor Walk and waterfront parks? So we looked at days in the summer of 2022 to kind of understand if there was this sort of correlation between heat and visitation. You might think that on hotter days you'd have more people coming. Um, so we just want to test that assumption. So here we have some scatter plots. On the x-axis, you have temperature. On the y-axis, you have the number of visits. Each dot here represents a day in summer 2022. And you can see that there's not a very strong pattern or correlation with visitation and temperature. And so this is by no means conclusive, but given what we found, we didn't really see any association, which is definitely curious given assumptions going in. But it's definitely something interesting that we found as well. Now, there's a lot of other queries that I did analysis for. If you go to the next slide, Christian, you can see some resources you have to look at those. So on the left, you have a GitHub data repository that I made. This has all of the Python code that I used for my analysis, as well as the summaries, the data summaries of that were generated in Tectonics. So those are just Excel files. So those are both there for you to take a look at. If you are so interested, feel free, if you're comfortable, to play around with the code. It's very, as Christian said, open source data and code is very important to me. I want it to be very clear what I was doing for anyone who wants to build on it in the future. And then also, if you would like to read the write-up that I made for all of these queries, that is also on the Boston Harbor Now website, available at this link as well. So feel free to take a look at those. And I'm now going to toss it back to Christian to do a little recap if we have any time, a little more summary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also want to hint that there is a printed version of Ford's report as well with all of the queries that's available. So if you're interested in that, definitely be in touch and we'll try to get you a hard copy of that. Bear with me while I try to get back to my notes. Let's see. Review. And okay. 1 second, folks. There we go. And okay. All right. Back at it. Thumbs up if you can see my slide. All right. Thank you. Yeah. Thumbs up. Oh, thanks. Yeah. So as you probably have heard, the studies has been really built, with academic rigor. But we're an advocacy group. Boston Harbor Now is an advocacy group with the goals to change hearts and minds and to bring about impact and change that we want to see, obviously, in the real world. And I want to sort of summarize really quickly to be able to save time for a Q&A, the impact.
Christian, I'm so sorry. We're getting some comments in the chat that folks can't see the slides, and I actually can't either.
Oh, apologies.
Sorry to interrupt. That's okay.
No, no, thanks for confirming. I just want to make
Mhm.
sure. How about now? Yes?
Still black screen, Christian.
Yes, still showing a black screen.
Let's see.
I could potentially share it.
Yeah, maybe Ford, you can share and I'll read from my presenter notes.
Yes, let me try to do that quickly.
And we're on slide 27.
Yes. 1 second, sorry.
So while Ford is getting that up, so as I was saying, this study is built to have impact, and the study's impact to date are thus far. We've presented at 4 national conferences and a couple of webinars from Cambridge to Seattle to Atlanta to Denver. Tell me when you're up, Ford.
Should be good now. Sorry about that.
No, you're great.
There we go.
Appreciate it. Thanks. Yep. So the studies also has been featured in the National Recreation and Park Association Park and Technology Report, really highlighting obviously how this methodology has been really different from any other analysis of visitation to public green open spaces across the country. So in many ways, what we're doing here in Boston is unique. Our tectonics, as you heard Ford talk about, our technology partners work with many, many different organization agencies across the country, including the Department of Defense, and have, really assisted us in this sort of groundbreaking approach just because we were helping them build due processes for their platform, because typically this isn't the type of analyses they're doing. So demonstrating not only change on the side of the data that we're interested in, but also the practice of data with this partner as well. Because the data and the approach has been demonstrating national interest on the subject, both across the country, but also here locally as well. Cities are beginning to ask similar question, and the data that we have in the report is beginning to shape some of the policy conversations that we're hoping to also continue to catalyze. Ford, feel free to move forward. There is a final study of the report, in addition to the one that the report that Ford's queries. It's available on waterfrontboston.org. It synthesizes analytics, validation study that we did with Mass Inc., hundreds of hours of interviews, and of course historical context into a beautiful and accessible framework. Speaking of frameworks, because we do believe at Boston Harbor Now that storytelling has the power and the potential to move people in the ways that data alone cannot, and we know this from our own lived experience. We intentionally surface individual families and community leaders to help shape those and share those stories. Here are some of the folks that were involved in this. We have a couple of families who live in Roxbury and Charlestown, a couple obviously representatives from BHN are featured in the report itself, as well as other local leaders, practitioners of change, whether they be people who are driving arts and music and culture, or people who are connecting their community to the waterfront. And then, of course, other sort of thought leaders within marketing and nonprofit advocacy spaces as well, to really help shape this report. So I do hope you have a chance to download it and read it and synthesize it. These are the community members, the folks that you see here on the screen, that have contributed to this incredible storytelling. Because, as we said, data does help summarize thousands of stories, but they also help to explain why these patterns exist, the ones that Ford were pointing to. And I'll leave you with this quote from Dan Heath, a New York Times bestselling author who writes about business psychology, ideas, and change. Dan says, data are just summaries of thousands of stories, as I mentioned. You tell a few of their stories to really help the data become meaningful. this philosophy really helps to guide the narrative layer of this study and is baked into that final report that I hope you have a chance to review. Finally, I want to say thank you. And Ford and I will take any questions that you may have.
Christian, Ford, thank you so much. I'm fortunate to be able to work with Christian on a daily basis, and so it was just amazing to see how this study has come together, and just really appreciate the work that both of you have done in sharing it with us today. So if there are any questions, could folks either raise their hands or drop them into the chat? I see two in the chat thus far that I'm happy to read. And if folks want to read their questions as well or share their questions, please just raise your hands. But Don had said, I'm interested to review the booklet. Is it available at Boston Public Libraries? If not, that would make it more accessible to all neighbors if publicized. Is it at Boston Public Libraries?
It is not yet at the Boston Public Library. Thank you, Don, for the question. It is available on our website at bostonharbornow.org or at, I forget what the URL is above, but I'm happy to share it in the link as well. But it's downloadable for anybody. It's a PDF.
Thanks so much, Christian. We have a question in the chat also from Roger, who asked, do you have ideas about what spaces and opportunities most draw visits to the waterfront? Play spaces, cooling, exercise, tourist, other? Is there qualitative data to support any of this?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hinted at within the report, but again, from the interviews that we're having with individuals as well as some of the in-person surveys that were conducted by Mass Inc. There is there are some suggestions, things like, grills are a great place to sort of bring folks together, whether it be families. One of our families that were interviewed specifically spoke about how much of a an attraction that is for their particular family. There are things just like accessibility, clean restrooms. So there's many different tactics that can be employed to sort of really make these spaces feel more welcoming. But that's one of the things that I think, many other communities are also looking at as well. And so, at the risk of providing a comprehensive strategy, because we're just one perspective on it. One of the things that we're going to be addressing is exactly this within the Cruise Summit, and talking about what are some of the shared practices, best practices in terms of ensuring that these spaces become, more welcoming and inclusive for all.
Thanks so much, Christian. Phil had a question in the chat as well, asking, do you have data about neighborhood demographics closest to the parks or open spaces? I would think proximity parallels visits.
Proximity does parallel visits. In fact, there's a hidden slide just at the risk of running over our allotted time that shows very much that proximity does impact people's ability to access and visits the waterfront. The further away from the water's edge you go, the fewer representatives of that neighborhood you see in utilizing some of those spaces. So you're not wrong there. But again, going back to the storytelling component of it, in one of the interviews, several of the interviews we talked about is how some of those family members are talking about like the cost, whether it's time or treasure, to get to their waterfront being a factor. So very much so, distance and proximity does play a role in terms of how accessible some space is.
Thank you so much, Christian. And this seems like a comment from Carter, who shared that it is so interesting, agreed, and hope you will take this thoughtful, thorough presentation on the road to national events like ASLA, City Parks Alliance, ULI, et cetera, which it sounds like you have already.
We're
Quite a
beginning
bit.
to. This is true. Yeah, no, we're not lucky enough to have Ford on our team all the time, and I'm just one person. But yes, no, that's a great suggestion. We're hoping to as this whole study was designed by just to be a thing where we share it very broadly. So yes, the landing page is the beginning of it, a printed report, a digital report, and then obviously as many conferences that would be interested. Recently, we were invited to present at the Americans Planner Association over in Denver. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to go, but they presented my report on my behalf. So there's a scalability component of this too. So doesn't require just the two of us, Ford and myself, taking the show on the road. Hopefully, many folks that are in this seminar are beginning to not only be aware of this information, but also access to the report and the open source data for you to be able to conduct your own analyses if you're thus inclined.
Thank you so much, Christian. And Alexis had shared the link to the report at bostonharbornow.org / waterfront data project. And then Christian shared the URL as well, the waterfrontboston.org, that I think redirects to that same page. Is that right,
Right.
Christian?
Yeah, it's
Awesome.
easier to remember than all of the
Yeah,
forward slash.
good idea. Ford, do you mind stopping sharing your screen? I think we're going to see if there's any other Q&A from folks. Feel free to raise your hand again or drop it in the chat. Any additional questions from folks for the presenters? Hearing and seeing none, I'm going to hand it to Alexis to preview our next month's seminar. And oh, we do have a question from Don. Don, do you want to read your question aloud? Oh, we can't hear you, Don. It seems like you're not muted, but we can't hear you.
How about now?
Yeah, we got you.
Great. It's one of those buttons that I push sometimes when I'm, actively sitting at my desk. So I'm a former City of Boston Parks ranger and then 7+ years as a Boston Harbor Islands educator, bringing thousands of kids out into the Harbor Islands, 34 islands and peninsulas. Don't forget that, the P word. And just wanted to state that you guys have done some great stuff. This is really cool to see how many people you've been able to target, collect information, and understand. I'm currently an employee at the US EPA Region 1 office, and a lot of us, to get out of our headspace or federal trauma, do walk over to the Harbor Walk to recharge, whether it's over to the New England Aquarium and just to look at those fabulous seals or just to get a breath of fresh sea air. And so I'm wondering, how do you ping a phone? So it's literally us, and if we decided to take a picture or it's a little creepy.
It's creepier than that, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so essentially, when the mobility data gets collected when your device is doing something, particularly like interacting with the internet. So
yeah,
if you are, making a post or doing something like that, that shows up as this like generic ping data.
sure.
Now I will say, like, we were not manually collecting that data, and we did not have any access to any particulars of, where every particular device was having ping data. That's not something that was um, in our possession or that I could see at all from our interface with the data at all. But
Okay.
I totally understand some privacy concerns, but do have some comfort that in our data agreement we were not allowed to see any level of information to that level at all.
Sure. I mean, but I think it's also, very cool that that's at least allows you an understanding of who is traveling to the Harbor Walk. Because I know some of the work that I did was trying to encourage with one of the earlier groups of the Boston Harbor Now, maybe when it was Island Alliance or something else, where we were drawing in people from Chinatown specifically. Because once the trails for Chinatown and the Greenway were just so much more connected, it was like, how do we invite those neighbors that are so close? Because I literally would walk to um, to the Josiah Quincy School and walk fifth graders from the Josiah Quincy School to the harbor with, the teacher and the fifth graders, the teacher holding an American flag and guiding us across the streets. And it's like, a lot of times what we've found is by bringing the youth there, we could then bring their parents later because now they knew about a resource that they didn't realize they had a front or backyard. And that's what we kind of advertised over the 7 years I worked there, that this is your yard. And if you don't have one, you really do, but it's just over here. Just come over the greenway. So thank you for promoting it and getting data so that we can start targeting people in a more productive, inviting, welcoming fashion. Great work.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing those insights, Don. And I think Christian and Ford, there is further information on the methodology and data collection within the report itself, too, right?
That's correct. Absolutely. I know
Awesome.
you're closing soon in terms of you want to do some housekeeping and tee up the next seminar. But I
Sure
want to
thing.
just thank Dawn for her question. It's exactly right. This is a temperature check for how much our public investments have contributed to obviously this incredible place that we call home. And Don, you'd be happy to know that the DCR is conducting their own version of a data analysis of their parks across the state as well. So that's really exciting. So be on the lookout for their version of this analysis as well. But
Fantastic.
one last thing I'll say about it is because this is an open data and we have these reports out, it's intended to empower groups like the ones that you're talking about to really begin to come up with strategies to address those particular, areas of interest for that particular community. We'll hold a summit coming in this fall, which I hope you and others join and participate in. But that's how we're going to move it beyond just understanding the data. It's about, what can we do to affect some change. To you, Alexis and Joe.
Thank you, Christian. And thanks everyone for joining. Thank you for the great questions. Thank you again, Christian and Ford, for the wonderful presentation. And I will hand it to Alexis to preview next month's seminar.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so our next seminar is on March 19th, and we're going to be featuring David Cash, who's the director of the Climate Action Accelerator at the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability at Harvard. If you're interested in attending, you can scan the QR code on the screen. And yeah, thank you all so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you at our next seminar.
Thanks again, all.